Hey everyone, welcome to the Happy Apophatic. In this episode, we're going to focus on the historical books, or what's also known as the former prophets. And these are books that are going to recount Israel's entry into the Promised Land. So it begins with the book of Joshua, and then is going to move through Judges, and then into 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. And so this is where we also get the monarchy, the kingdom of David, and what happens after David. So the book of Joshua begins with the death of Moses, and Joshua has taken over. And what Joshua does is he reiterates the promise that God would give land, but what God says to Joshua is that they must keep Torah. They have to keep the law before them and obey everything that the Lord commands and not turn to it from the left or to the right. And so it's this Torah obedience, this Torah faithfulness, that is going to frame the book. You're going to get it at the beginning, you get it at the end, and in the middle, what do we find? We find the giving of the land, and we also find this chapter of covenant renewal, where God renews covenant with his people. And what's important about this is that the book of Joshua is saying that the land is a gift from God that is to be given. So as I've said in past lectures, one of the interesting tensions that exist in the Old Testament is Israel's constant desire to do things under their own power, to put things into their own hands and under their own control. So we saw that when God promises to give Abraham children, and Sarah says, "Here, take Hagar." We see it throughout the Old Testament, where Israel is kind of fighting and wrestling with God, wanting to do their own thing and put trust in their own strength. And God is trying to say, well, no, just be faithful to me and I will do this for you. And so one of the themes of the book of Joshua is that the land is a gift, and it's grounded in covenant. And it's kind of like being in the Garden of Eden. So, in the Garden of Eden, they're given the command from God, don't eat from the tree. And as long as they don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, they stay. They're blessed. They stay in the land. And it's the same thing here. As long as they fulfill their part of the covenant, then they will be blessed, and they will live in the land and that God had promised them. And so that's what kind of is the focus of Joshua. And you get these narratives about God's giving the land to them. So you get the Battle of Jericho, in which the people are marching around and God brings the walls down. The whole focus is on the giving of the land, and the land as God's grace. So from Joshua to Judges, it's almost as if you move from this positive emphasis upon Torah obedience and taking the land to the disobedience of Israel. As we've seen throughout the entire Torah and Pentateuch, we see God giving a law and then Israel disobeying. And so this is what the book of Judges is about. And in some ways what it does is it begins a new creation story, that the chaos of Genesis 1 is back. And this is seen in the verse, everyone did what was right in their own eyes. We see that pop up again and again in this book. And we can also see that the book of Judges is grounded in a cycle. The Israelites disobey God. They are oppressed and ruled over by a foreign nation. They cry out to God, and then God delivers them, or provides a deliverer for them. It raises up a judge who will deliver them. And so this becomes the cycle that moves its way through the story. And there are many little judges that work their way through the narrative, but there are three primary judges around which this story is, or the book is organized. The first one is Deborah. And again, what's interesting is the connection that you find between Deborah, Hannah, who will come in 1 Samuel, and Mary. So in the Deborah story, we see God providing victory through a woman, Deborah, through another woman, Jael, who puts the tent stake through a guy's skull. And then you get this song of deliverance. And what's interesting is that song kind of shoots like an arrow through Hannah's prayer after Samuel is born, but then into the song of Mary that comes in the New Testament. And then we have the Gideon story. And what happens in the Gideon story is, again, a replay of this temptation of military power and strength. Who will deliver Israel from the Midianites? God raises up Gideon, but Gideon is kind of struggling with God to a certain degree. He wants to do it by his own hand. And you get these little phrases in there where Gideon is worried that he's not going to get the proper credit. There's even a line in there where they're going to charge and they're going to try to take out the Midianites, and it's for the Lord and Gideon. And so though Gideon is a good guy in the text, you see that kind of tension that exists with Israel, and that they want to continually put their trust in their own power and their own military strength. To the point that at the beginning of the story, God whittles Gideon's army down because he doesn't want Gideon and the Israelites to think that they've done this on their own power. And then, of course, you have the Samson story. And the Samson story is a fascinating narrative that symbolizes the people of Israel. Samson is somebody who is supposed to be set apart. He is supposed to be holy. He's a Nazirite. He's not supposed to cut his hair or drink wine or come into contact with a dead body. And so he's set apart for the Lord. He is not supposed to intermarry with foreign women, and yet his whole life is him doing the things that he is not supposed to do. And ultimately, it leads to him having his hair cut and his strength leaves him, and he is put into captivity. He's brought into captivity. They gouge out his eyes. His strength has left him. And then at the very end of the story, he cries out to God, who hears his cry. His hair grows back, and they bring him up to mock him, and he puts his hands on the pillar, and he causes the temple to collapse. And so through his own death and suffering, the people of Israel are delivered. And so the Samson story becomes this symbol of the people of Israel, of Israel's own nation and Israel's own identity. She's to be set apart, but yet she struggles to obey God's commands. She ends up in exile, and then in exile, God will deliver, and through that deliverance and suffering will defeat the enemies of God's people. And so from Judges, it kind of ends with there was no king in the land. And so it's pushing ahead to David becoming king. So everything now is kind of pushing ahead to this person and figure of David and the rise of the monarchy and the nation of Israel. And so 1st and 2nd Samuel begin with the birth of Samuel, and Samuel becomes this prophet, this forerunner of David. We also see how God chooses first King Saul. And interestingly, King Saul, by all cultural standards, and so by a cultural standard, he seems like the right choice. Yet, what we see is he too falls into disobedience, and God is going to raise up David. And it's interesting how that choice of David comes. David is the youngest, he's the smallest, and the text, even in the whole David and Goliath story, talks about how small and ruddy he is. He is not the largest. And so from a cultural perspective and from a patriarchal and patrilineal perspective, a Near Eastern perspective, David does not seem like the ideal king. But again, God chooses David to now become the king that will be the symbol of God's presence and God's reign and rule over the people of Israel. And so it's important for us to see in 1st and 2nd Samuel how we get Saul and David are kind of set against one another. Saul has all the military armor and all of that stuff, and yet he's afraid to fight Goliath. David comes in and says, I trust in the Lord, and he goes to the battlefield with a sling, and he defeats the enemies of God's people. And so then you get into the narrative of David as king. And David has kind of two downfalls. The first is Bathsheba, Uriah and Bathsheba, where he has an affair with Bathsheba. She becomes pregnant, and he tries to have Uriah killed. And Nathan the prophet comes and confronts him on this. But then also later in the book of 2 Samuel, God gets angry with him because he has a census. And the reason that you have a census is because you want to create a military. You're looking to see how many people you have so you can create a military. And so again, the focal point of David taking something that doesn't belong to him in Bathsheba, but also wanting to put his trust in military strength and might, you see these are kind of his two downfalls. What's important, though, is that David, when he's confronted by Nathan, he always confesses, and he confesses to God and receives forgiveness, even though there are consequences for these actions. And the consequences are that the kingdom is going to be fractured down the road. And then we get to 1st and 2nd Kings that focus on Solomon and the building of the temple, and the prophetic community of Elijah and Elisha. And I think what's important for us to recognize of 1st and 2nd Kings is we see the temple get built, but we also see how Solomon is not a good guy. We see how Solomon is doing the very things that Israel is not supposed to do and that a king is not supposed to do. He's not supposed to go back to Egypt and get horses and chariots. That's what he does. He's not supposed to marry foreign wives. That's what he does. He sets up idols all around as kind of a pantheon of gods. And so Solomon is not necessarily set up as a good guy or a good king. And it eventually leads to the fracturing and the splintering of the kingdom into a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. What's important, though, too, is how the kings of both the north and the south fall away. They're no longer keeping Torah. And we see how David becomes kind of the ideal. And the text will say that he followed in the footsteps of his father David, or he did not follow in the footsteps of his father David. And so David, the one after God's own heart, becomes the ideal king, the Torah keeper, the one through whom God rules over his people. And he becomes the standard by which these other kings are being judged. But you get a prophetic community that arises in Elijah and Elisha. And this prophetic community is going to confront these kings. So Elijah and Ahab and Jezebel is confronting their disobedience, confronts the prophets of Baal, has a showdown with them, a throwdown, a turf battle on Mount Carmel. And that prophetic spirit is then passed on to Elisha. And Elisha is the one who begins to speak and represents the word that God speaks outside of the system, outside of the kingship and the temple and all of these things. Now, I think what's important for us to recognize is that this prophetic community, the narrative of Elijah and Elisha, is going to become a pattern for the Gospels. That Jesus is going to do some of this and say some of the same things that Elijah does. And so when we get to the Gospels, it will be important for us to reflect back and compare and contrast how some of the same things, like raising the widow's son from the dead, these are things that Jesus does as well. And so this prophetic community of Elijah and Elisha become the model for the ministry of Jesus in many ways. And in the 1st and 2nd Samuel, this prophetic community is pushing back against the disobedience of the kings and the temple and the false worship of the people, and is speaking out as to the disobedience of the people of Israel. We're also reminded of Moses. So Elijah and Moses are connected together, and we'll see that when we get to the Gospels, these two figures are connected together. So in the same way that Moses was constantly having to deal with a disobedient people, here Elijah and Elisha are doing the same from a prophetic sense. And then all of this leads to and culminates in the exile. So all of this disobedience, this lack of turning, fulfills what Moses says in Deuteronomy 27 and 28. Obey Torah and it will go well with you. Disobey Torah and you'll be cursed. And what is the curse? Alienation, being kicked out of the land, being exiled. So when we talked about how the exile connects with even the Exodus and oppression under Egypt, and the name that God speaks, and the forsakenness of the people, that God's presence leaves them and they are sent away into exile, away from the land and away from the temple. The northern kingdom goes first in 2 Kings 17. Assyria comes in and conquers them. And then in 2 Kings 25, we find the southern kingdom, Judah, is also taken away into captivity. And it's from here that we'll move into the prophetic books that speak about this judgment that God unleashes, the exile that pushes them into Assyria and Babylon, but also the hope that the prophets proclaim that God would come one day and lead a new exodus and bring his people back and restore his people to the land.